I shouldn't have ignored it. I didn't think much of it at the time. That's probably the part that bothers me the most. None of it felt dangerous when it was happening. It just felt slightly off, like noticing a detail that doesn't quite belong but choosing to ignore it anyway. The first time, I was standing at a door, waiting for it to open. When it finally did, the man on the other side didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me like I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. I remember thinking it was strange, but not enough to question it. The second time, I was alone on a road that didn't feel as empty as it should have. There was someone out there with me, standing just far enough away to make it unclear what they wanted. They didn't move, they didn't speak. And for some reason, neither did I the last time I was inside. Somewhere I should have felt safe. I woke up with this quiet feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. I just lay there, telling myself it was nothing. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not what happened, but the moment before it did. The second where something feels wrong and you convince yourself it's not. Because acknowledging it would mean accepting that you're already closer to danger than you thought. None of these moments felt like warnings at the time. But looking back, they were the only chances I had to do something differently. And the worst part is, I remember each one clearly, right before everything shifted. And I realized Story 1, the last delivery of the night. And I realized I should have paid attention to it. At the time, though, it just felt like another late delivery. I was already tired, and I remember thinking about skipping it. It was close to the end of my shift, and the area it was going to was a little farther out than I liked at night. Quiet neighborhoods, long streets, not many people around. But it was the last order, and I figured I'd just get it done and head home. The drive there felt normal. Nothing stood out. Streetlights spaced out evenly, a few houses with lights on. Everything exactly how you'd expect it to be. Even the address didn't seem unusual when I checked it. Just another house on a quiet street. But when I turned onto the final road, that's when something started to feel slightly off. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. The street just felt darker than the others, not because the lights were out, but because fewer of them were on. Most of the houses were completely dark, like everyone had already gone to sleep. I slowed down as I got closer to the address, double-checking the numbers on the houses. When I found it, I actually hesitated for a second. There was no porch light on. That happens sometimes, so I didn't think too much of it at first. But usually, when someone orders food that late, they at least leave a light on or keep an eye out. This house looked completely still. No lights inside, no movement, nothing that suggested someone was expecting a delivery. I grabbed the bag and walked up anyway. The closer I got, the more I noticed how quiet it was. No TV sounds, no footsteps, no voices. It's just that kind of silence that feels heavier the longer you stand in it. I knocked once. Nothing. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again, a little louder this time. I remember glancing back at the street, just out of habit, still empty. Then, without any sound leading up to it, the door opened. Not quickly, not slowly either, just enough. A man was standing there. He didn't say anything. At first I thought, maybe he didn't hear me clearly, or maybe he was just confused. So I started to speak, something normal like confirming the order. But before I could finish, I realized he was already looking directly at me. Not at the bag, not at the receipt. Just at me, and he wasn't reacting. No greeting, no question, nothing. Just standing there like he had been waiting, but not in the way you'd expect. I awkwardly held out the bag, and after a second he took it. His movements were slow, almost delayed, like he was thinking about each step before doing it. Still no words. That was the part that stuck with me, even then. Most people say something, even if it's just thanks or yeah. He didn't. As he took the bag, the door opened slightly wider for a moment, and I caught a glimpse inside. I didn't fully register it at the time, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just dark. It was empty in a way that didn't match the situation. No lights on, no visible furniture near the entrance, nothing that suggested someone had just been inside waiting for food. And I think there might have been something else deeper in the house. Something I almost focused on, but didn't. Because right after that, the door started to close again, still without a single word. It shut completely, and just like that, it was over. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, staring at the door, waiting for anything to happen, but nothing did. So I turned around and walked back to my car, telling myself it was just a weird interaction. At the time, that's all it felt like. Just a little off. The silence that didn't make sense, I didn't think about it right away. I got back into my car, set the bag down where it had been, and started the engine like I always did. For a few seconds, everything felt normal again. Just another delivery. Just another quiet house. Nothing worth holding on to. But as I pulled away from the curb, something stayed with me. It wasn't a specific detail. It was more like a feeling that hadn't gone away when it should have. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the door open again or a light turn on inside the house, but there was nothing. The place looked exactly the same as when I had walked up to it. Dark still, like no one had ever been there at all. That's when I started replaying it. The way he opened the door, the way he just stood there. I realized I couldn't remember him blinking. It sounds like a small thing, but the more I thought about it, the more it stood out. People blink without thinking. It's automatic. I couldn't picture it happening even once. He had just been still, watching me in a way that didn't feel curious or annoyed, just empty. I drove a little farther down the street, slower than I needed to. That silence came back to me too. Not just outside, but inside the house. There hadn't been anything. No TV playing in another room, no footsteps, no shifting, nothing that suggested someone had been moving around before opening the door. It was the kind of silence you only notice after the fact, when you realize something that should have been there. Wasn't I almost pulled over? I actually remember my hand tightening on the steering wheel as I slowed down near the end of the street. Part of me wanted to check the address again just to make sure I hadn't gone to the wrong place. Another part of me thought about turning around, maybe knocking one more time, just to see if anything felt different, but I didn't. It felt unnecessary. Even as the thought crossed my mind, I could already hear myself explaining it away. It was late. People act weird. Maybe he just didn't want to talk. Maybe the house was empty because he had just moved in. Or maybe everything was in another room. There were too many easy explanations, so I kept driving. By the time I got back onto the main road, I had mostly convinced myself it didn't matter. I turned on the radio, let the noise fill the space, and focused on getting home. It should have ended there. But a few minutes later, I glanced at my phone to clear the order, and that's when something else caught my attention. The details didn't look right. At first, I thought I was just misreading it while driving, so I slowed down and checked again more carefully. The name on the order, the payment status, even the timestamps, something about it didn't match what I remembered seeing before I dropped it off. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, and for the first time since I left that house, the feeling came back stronger. Not just that something was off, but that I had missed something important while I was standing right there. The realization I told myself to wait until I got home to look at it properly, but I didn't. I pulled over a few streets away, parked under a dim streetlight, and opened the app again. The screen loaded slowly, like it didn't want to show me anything new. And for a second, I thought maybe it would just look normal again. It didn't. The order was still there, but parts of it had changed. The name was different from what I remembered seeing earlier. Not completely different, just off enough that I couldn't be sure which version was right. The payment status didn't show as completed anymore either. It was blank, like it hadn't gone through at all. I refreshed it. Same thing. It didn't make sense. I wouldn't have been able to complete the delivery if the order wasn't confirmed. That's how it worked. Everything had to be processed before it even showed up on my end. I checked the address next. For a second, I thought I had typed it in wrong. The street name looked familiar, but the house number didn't match what I had just driven to. I went back and forth between the screens, comparing it to the one still in my memory. They weren't the same. I sat there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch. Apps mess up sometimes. Orders update weirdly. There were simple explanations for all of it. But none of them explained the part that kept bothering me. The inside of that house, it came back to me slowly, like my mind had skipped over it the first time and was only now filling it in. When the door opened wider for that second, I hadn't really looked. I had just glanced, then focused back on the guy standing in front of me. But now I could picture it more clearly. There wasn't anything near the entrance. No table, no shoes, no signs that someone lived there in the way you'd expect. It felt too empty for a place where someone had just ordered food. And deeper inside, there was something else. hadn't seen it directly, not clearly enough to understand it. But I remembered the shape of something that didn't fit. Something low, maybe, or out of place in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't moving, but it also didn't feel like furniture. The more I tried to focus on it, the harder it was to pin down. That's what made it worse, because it meant I had noticed it in the moment and chosen not to think about it. I looked back down at my phone again, but it didn't help. The order still didn't make sense. The details didn't line up. It was like the entire thing had only existed long enough for me to complete it, and then it started to fall apart. I thought about going back, just to check the house again, see if it was still dark, if the door would open the same way, if the man would still be there. But that feeling from earlier came back stronger than before. Not curiosity, something closer to understanding. Whatever had been happening behind that door wasn't meant to be interrupted. And the only reason I had been standing there at all was because I had knocked first. Transition? That wasn't the first time I told myself it was just a weird delivery. Something I could forget about after a few days, the same way you forget small, uncomfortable moments that don't lead to anything. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. I stopped checking the app, stopped thinking about the house, stopped trying to make sense of it. But the feeling didn't fully go away. It just stayed somewhere in the background. And the more I thought about it later, the more I realized something that bothered me even more than the delivery itself. That wasn't the first time I had ignored a feeling like that. It wasn't even the first time something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The difference was most of the time nothing happened after, or at least nothing obvious. That's what makes it easy to dismiss. When there's no clear outcome, no immediate danger, you convince yourself it didn't matter. That it was just your mind overreacting, trying to turn something normal into something it's not. But sometimes, I think that's exactly how it works. Whatever you want to call it. It doesn't always act the way you expect. It doesn't rush you, doesn't force anything, doesn't make itself obvious. Sometimes it just waits, quiet, watching, and giving you every chance to ignore it. Story 2 stranded on an empty road the second time didn't feel connected to the first at all. If anything, it felt even more normal in the beginning. I was driving late, later than I usually would, cutting through a stretch of road that most people avoid at night. It wasn't dangerous or anything like that. It's just long, empty, and quiet. The kind of road where you don't see another car for minutes at a time, and the streetlights are spaced out just enough to leave parts of it in darkness. I had taken that route before, so I wasn't really thinking about it. It's just focused on getting home. The radio was on low, more for background noise than anything else. Outside, everything looked the same as it always did. Flat land on either side, occasional trees, nothing that really stood out. Then the car started acting strange. At first, it was small, slight hesitation when I pressed the gas, like it wasn't responding properly. I remember frowning, easing off a little, then trying again. Worked for a second, then did it again. Thought maybe I was imagining it. But a few seconds later, the engine made this dull, uneven sound, and the car started slowing down on its own. That's when I knew something was wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching lightly against gravel as I came to a stop. The engine kept running, but it didn't sound right anymore. There was a roughness to it, like it was struggling to stay on. I sat there for a moment, just listening, then it cut off completely, just like that. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. I tried starting it again, turning the key slowly, but nothing happened. It's just a weak sound, then nothing. I tried a second time, then a third. Same result. I leaned back in my seat, exhaling quietly. At that point, it didn't feel scary, just frustrating. I reached for my phone, already thinking about calling someone or checking for nearby help. But as soon as I looked at the screen, I saw there was no signal, not even a weak one. I held it up, moved it around slightly, like that would make a difference. Nothing changed. That's when the situation shifted a little, not into fear, just awareness. I looked out through the windshield, taking in the road ahead of me. It stretched out into darkness, the next streetlight barely visible in the distance. Behind me, it was the same. No cars, no movement, just quiet. I checked the time, then looked back at my phone again, hoping the signal would come back on its own. It didn't, so I just sat there, waiting, without really knowing what I was waiting for. Minutes passed. I'm not sure how many. Long enough for the silence to settle in, for the inconvenience of the situation to start feeling a little heavier. That's when I noticed something. At first, it was just movement, far ahead on the road, just inside the edge of the next patch of light. I narrowed my eyes slightly, trying to focus on it. For a second, I thought it might be a shadow shifting or something moving in the distance, but then it became clearer. It was a person, walking, slowly. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. Just a shape moving steadily toward me step by step, staying right in the middle of the road. I remember sitting up a little straighter, watching them. At first, it didn't feel strange. People walk. Maybe they live nearby. Maybe they were heading somewhere, just like I had been. But the longer I looked, the more something about it didn't sit right. They weren't looking around. They weren't reacting to anything, just walking straight toward me. The approach, I kept watching them as they got closer. At first, I told myself it was a good thing. Someone was coming. Maybe they had a phone, maybe they could help. Maybe I wouldn't have to sit there alone waiting for something to happen. But the closer they got, the harder it was to hold on to that thought. There was something about the way they moved. It wasn't fast or aggressive. If anything, it was too calm. Each step looked the same as the last, perfectly even, like they weren't adjusting to anything around them. Not the uneven edge of the road, not the gravel near where I was parked. Just a straight, steady path forward. And they never looked anywhere else. Not down at the ground, not off to the side, just forward. At me. I felt that shift again. It's the same kind of feeling I had at the house, where nothing is clearly wrong, but something isn't lining up the way it should. I reached for my phone again, more out of instinct than anything else, checking the screen like the signal might have suddenly appeared. Still nothing. When I looked back up, they were closer now. Close enough that I could make out more of their shape, but not enough to see their face clearly. The light from the street lamp behind them didn't help much. It just made them look darker, more like a silhouette moving toward me. I thought about stepping out of the car, just to meet them halfway, to say something normal, ask for help. That's what you're supposed to do in a situation like that. But something held me back. So I stayed where I was, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching them approach. They didn't slow down until they were just outside the reach of my headlights. Then they stopped. Not right next to the car. Not even close enough to speak comfortably. Just a few steps away. Standing there, I waited for them to say something. Anything. A question, a greeting, even just a simple, "Are you okay?" But nothing came. They didn't move closer. Didn't raise a hand, didn't tilt their head, didn't give any sign that they were about to speak. They just stood there, facing me, watching. The silence stretched out longer than it should have. I became aware of how still everything was. No wind, no distant cars, no sound of footsteps shifting against the road. Just the faint ticking of my engine cooling down and the quiet space between me and them. I considered rolling down the window, just a little, enough to ask for help without stepping out. My hand actually moved toward the control before I stopped myself. Something about the distance felt intentional, like they had chosen that exact spot for a reason, close enough to see me clearly, far enough that I couldn't reach them without making the first move. And for some reason, I didn't want to be the one who did that, so I stayed still. So did they. The moment that didn't happen, I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt longer than it probably was, but time moves differently when nothing is happening and you're waiting for something too. My hand rested near the window control, not moving, just there. I kept thinking I should say something, anything, just to break the silence. Even a simple question would have been enough. "Do you have a phone? Something normal?" The words never came out. Every time I thought about speaking, something held me back. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like hesitation that didn't make sense. Like there was a part of me that already knew something about this wasn't right, even if I couldn't explain why. So I stayed quiet. They did too. They didn't shift their weight, didn't take a step forward or back, just stood there exactly where they had stopped, facing me in a way that felt too focused, too deliberate. I tried to make out their face again, leaning forward slightly, but the angle of the light made it difficult. It was like the details didn't want to come into focus. I could see the outline of their head, their shoulders, the way their arms hung at their sides, but nothing more than that. No expression, no reaction, just presence. The silence started to feel heavier the longer it went on. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It felt like something waiting, like the moment before a decision gets made. I thought again about rolling down the window. This time I even reached out and pressed the button lightly, just enough for the glass to shift a fraction of an inch. And then I stopped. I don't know why. Something about that small movement made everything feel too real. Like once I crossed that line, whatever this was would change into something else. So I let the button go, and the window stayed closed. For a second, nothing changed. They didn't react, didn't move, just watched. Then far behind them, I noticed something. A faint glow at the edge of the road, headlights, distant, but getting closer. I shifted my attention for just a moment, glancing past the figure to confirm it. Another car, finally. The light grew slightly brighter as it moved along the road toward us. Relief came with it, quiet but immediate. I looked back at the figure. They were gone, not walking away, not turning, just gone. The space where they had been standing was empty, like nothing had ever been there in the first place. I sat there, staring at that spot, trying to process it. There hadn't been any sound, no footsteps on the gravel, no movement that I could track. One second they were there, the next they weren't. The headlights grew stronger behind me, filling the road with light. But I couldn't stop looking at the place where they had been, because whatever had just happened. It didn't feel like something that was supposed to. Aftermath, the headlights reached me a few seconds later. I blinked, like I needed to reset my eyes, and turned slightly as the car slowed down behind mine. The sudden brightness filled everything, pushing the darkness back into the edges where it had been sitting the whole time. A man stepped out, calling toward me, asking if everything was okay. His voice sounded normal. That was the first thing I noticed. It broke the silence in a way that felt almost jarring, like something had been missing and I hadn't realized how much until it came back. I opened my door and stepped out, explaining what happened with the car, keeping my voice steady, trying to sound like nothing else was wrong. I didn't mention the figure. Not at first. He walked over to the front of my car, asked me to try starting it again while he looked at it. And this time, it turned over without hesitation. The engine came back to life like nothing had ever been wrong. We both paused for a second. I remember him saying something like, "That's strange," but in a casual way, like it didn't matter, and I let it go. I thanked him, got back into the car, and pulled back onto the road. He followed behind me for a short distance before turning off onto another street, his headlights disappearing the same way they had appeared. After that, everything felt normal again. The road, the drive, the quiet, but it didn't feel the same. I kept replaying it in my head, not just what happened, but what didn't. The figure never spoke, never asked for anything, never even tried to get closer. They just stood there, waiting. And I had almost responded. That's the part that stayed with me. How close I came to opening that window, to saying something, to turning a moment of silence into something real. I don't know what would have happened if I did. And that's exactly what makes it worse. Because whatever that moment was, it felt like it was leading somewhere. And I chose not to find out. Transition, the worst one, was indoors after that. I started paying more attention to those moments. Not enough to change anything, not enough to act differently, but enough to notice when something felt slightly off. And for a while, I convinced myself that what happened on that road was just rare. One of those situations you end up in once and never again. At least that's what I told myself. Because being out there, alone, in the dark, it makes sense that things feel different. Your mind fills in gaps, stretches silence into something heavier than it really is. You expect to feel uneasy when you're isolated like that. There's a kind of distance between you and everything else. But being inside is supposed to be different. Inside, things are controlled, familiar. You know where everything is? What every sound means? What belongs and what doesn't. It's the one place where your mind doesn't need to question every small detail, or at least it's supposed to feel that way. The last time, didn't. And that's what made it worse than the others. Because this time, there wasn't any distance at all. Story 3. The temporary room it was only supposed to be for a few days. Relative had asked me to stay at their place while they were out of town, just to keep an eye on things. Nothing complicated. Feed a pet that mostly kept to itself, check the mail, make sure everything stayed the way they left it. The house itself was normal, not old enough to feel strange, not new enough to feel unfamiliar. Just a quiet, lived-in space in a neighborhood where nothing really happened. When I first got there, everything felt exactly how it should. Clean, organized, still, that kind of stillness that comes from a place being temporarily empty. I set my things down, walked through each room once, more out of habit than anything else. Kitchen, living room, hallway, then the spare bedroom where I'd be staying. Nothing stood out. Everything looked like it had been left with intention, like someone had expected to come back soon. The first night was quiet. I remember noticing how little noise there was compared to my own place. No distant traffic, no voices through the walls, nothing but the occasional creak of the house settling. It felt peaceful, more than anything else. I slept without any problems. The second day was the same. I kept to a routine, checked things off the list I'd been given, didn't think much about anything outside of that. If there was anything unusual, I didn't notice it yet. It wasn't until the second night that something felt slightly off. It started small. I went into the kitchen to get something to drink and noticed one of the cabinet doors wasn't fully closed. It's just slightly open, enough to catch my attention. I paused for a second, trying to remember if I had left it that way earlier. I couldn't be sure, so I closed it and moved on. Later that night, I noticed something else. A chair at the dining table that wasn't in the same position I remembered it being. Not moved far, just angled differently, like someone had shifted it slightly and then left it. Again, I tried to think back. Maybe I had moved it without realizing. It didn't feel important enough to question. But it stayed in the back of my mind. By the third day, I started paying more attention. Not in a panicked way, just noticing things more carefully. Small details. The way objects were placed, how doors were left, whether anything looked different from how I remembered it. Most of the time, everything seemed normal. But every once in a while, something wouldn't line up perfectly. A door that felt slightly more open than it should have been. An item on the counter that I didn't remember using. Nothing major. Nothing I could point to and say for sure that it had changed. Just enough to make me stop and think for a second longer than usual. The nights were worse. It's not because anything obvious happened, but because of the silence. It wasn't the same kind of silence I had noticed before. This one felt more layered. It's like there were small sounds buried underneath it that didn't quite come through. Faint shifts, soft creaks that didn't follow a pattern. I would lie in bed listening, trying to decide if what I was hearing was just the house settling or something else entirely. Most of the time, I convinced myself it was nothing. That's the thing about places like that. When you're alone, it's easy to explain everything away, till you start realizing how often you're doing it. The presence, after a while, it stopped feeling random. That was the part that changed everything. Up until then, I could tell myself I was just forgetting things. That I wasn't paying close enough attention, that I was moving objects without realizing it. It wasn't impossible. It happens more than people think. But once you start noticing a pattern, it's harder to ignore. I began checking things before I left a room. Not in an obvious way, just small details. I'd take a second to look at how a chair was positioned, how far a door was open, where something was placed on the counter. Nothing extreme, just enough that I could tell if it had changed later. At first, everything stayed the same, and it didn't. I would come back into a room and feel it immediately, before even looking directly at anything. That quiet sense that something had shifted slightly while I wasn't there. And when I focused on it, there it was. A cabinet door not fully closed again. A chair angled just enough that I knew I hadn't left it that way. Once, even the bathroom light was on when I was sure I had turned it off. That one made me pause longer than the others. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, staring at the light spilling out from under the door, trying to replay the moment I had left that room earlier. I could picture it clearly reaching for the switch, watching the light go out, but now it was on. I walked over slowly, opened the door, and turned it off again. Nothing else looked out of place. Still, something about it didn't sit right. That's when I started thinking about the rest of the house differently. There was a door at the end of the hallway that stayed closed. It wasn't locked, at least not in a way that needed a key. But it was one of those doors that you just don't open without a reason. I had passed it multiple times without thinking about it, treating it like part of the background. But now I kept noticing it, Not because it was open, but because it wasn't. It stayed exactly the same every time I walked by. Closed, still untouched. In a house where small things kept shifting, that door didn't change at all. One night I stopped in front of it. I don't remember deciding to, I just did. I stood there for a moment, looking at the handle, thinking about how easy it would be to check. Just open it, look inside, confirm that everything was normal, and move on. I even reached out, my hand hovering just inches away, and then I stopped. The same feeling came back. Not fear, not exactly. Just that quiet hesitation that didn't make sense. Like opening that door would turn everything I wasn't sure about into something real. So I pulled my hand back, told myself there was no reason to check, and walked away. But after that, I couldn't stop thinking about what might be on the other side. The night it felt real, it happened a few nights later. I woke up without knowing why. There was no sound that pulled me out of sleep, no sudden movement or noise that I could point to. One moment I was asleep, and the next I was just awake. Completely. I stayed still for a second, trying to figure out what had caused it. The room was dark, just faint outlines of familiar shapes barely visible in the low light coming through the window. Everything looked the same, but something felt different. It wasn't immediate panic. It was quieter than that. Just a feeling that something wasn't how it had been a few seconds before. It's like waking up into a moment that had already started without you. I listened. That was the first thing I did. I focused on the silence, trying to pick apart any small sound that didn't belong. At first there was nothing. It's just the usual quiet of the house at night. The kind I had already gotten used to over the past few days. But the longer I stayed still, the more aware I became of how intentional that silence felt. Like it wasn't just the absence of noise. Like something was holding it in place. I shifted slightly in bed, careful not to make too much movement, just enough to adjust my position and look toward the doorway. The door was open the same way I always left it, leading out into the dark hallway. Nothing there, no movement. No shape or shadow that stood out. Still, I didn't feel alone. That thought came into my mind slowly, not all at once. It wasn't a reaction to anything I saw or heard. It was just there. A quiet understanding that didn't have a reason. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, listening harder now, waiting for something to confirm it, some small sound or shift that would prove I wasn't imagining it. But nothing came. It's no footsteps, no doors opening or closing. It's no sign of anything moving through the house. And somehow, that made it worse. Because if there had been a sound, I could have followed it, could have understood it, placed it somewhere in the space around me. But this felt like something that didn't need to move to be there. I kept staring at the doorway, expecting something to change. It didn't. Everything stayed exactly the same. And that was the moment it felt real. Not because something happened, but because nothing did. And I couldn't explain why that felt so wrong. The final detail after that night, I stopped trying to convince myself it was nothing. I didn't leave immediately, but something had shifted. I moved through the house differently, more aware of where I was, what I touched, what I left behind. I stopped ignoring the small things even if I didn't fully understand them. Still nothing happened in a way I could prove. No direct signs, no clear evidence. Just that same quiet feeling, always there in the background. The day I was supposed to leave, I woke up early. Not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to spend another night there. I packed my things slowly, going room to room, making sure everything was exactly how it had been when I arrived, at least as close as I could remember. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, closed doors, straightened chairs, made everything look untouched. It felt important. Like leaving it any other way would mean acknowledging something I couldn't explain. The last place I checked was the bedroom. I stood there for a moment, looking around, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. The bed was made, my bag was by the door, everything in place. It looked normal, almost too normal. That's when I noticed it. At first, it didn't stand out. It's just a small detail, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Probably would have overlooked it a few days earlier. But now, I couldn't. The closet door was slightly open. Not wide enough to see inside clearly, just enough to show a thin strip of darkness between the door and the frame. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I'd barely used the closet the entire time I was there. When I did, I made sure it was closed all the way. It was one of those things I had started checking without thinking. I walked closer, slow without meaning to. The gap didn't change. I stopped just in front of it, looking at that narrow opening, feeling that same hesitation I had felt before. The same quiet warning that didn't come from anything I could see or hear. For a second, I thought about opening it, just to check. Just to finally confirm that there was nothing there. But I didn't. I reached out, placed my hand on the door and pushed it shut instead. It closed easily. Too easily. I stood there for another moment, listening, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. So I grabbed my bag, walked out of the room, and left the house without looking back. I didn't lock the closet, and I never checked what was inside. Closing reflection, it was never obvious when I think back on all of it. None of those moments felt dangerous while they were happening. That's what connects them. It's not the places, not the situations, not even the people. It's the fact that every single time, there was a point where something felt slightly wrong, and I chose not to act on it. At the door, I could have stepped back, asked a question, taken a second to understand what I was looking at, instead of brushing it off. On the road, I could have rolled down the window, said something, closed that distance instead of sitting in silence and pretending it didn't matter. In that house, I could have opened the door, checked the room, forced myself to face whatever was behind it instead of turning away. But I didn't, and the more I think about it, the more I realize that's what makes it unsettling. It wasn't obvious. There were no warnings that felt urgent, no clear signs that something was wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. Everything was quiet, controlled, just normal enough to pass as nothing. That's how it stays hidden. Whatever it was in each of those moments, it didn't rush. It didn't force anything, didn't need to. It just stayed there, waiting, letting me decide not to look closer. I used to think fear came from understanding something too clearly, from seeing exactly what you're dealing with and realizing you can't do anything about it. But now, I think it's the opposite. The worst part is getting close to understanding, stopping just short of it, because that's where everything lingers. All the questions, all the possibilities, everything that could have been happening, just out of sight. And once you notice that, it doesn't really go away. You start seeing those moments more often, small things that don't quite make sense. Silences that feel a little too complete. Details that seem just slightly out of place. I still catch myself in those situations sometimes. Now I don't ignore them anymore. But I also don't always act on them. Sometimes. I just notice. And that's enough to make me stop what I'm doing even now, wondering if this is one of those moments again. Or if I'm already past the point where noticing would have made a difference.